Well, hi everyone. Thank you for tuning in to, well, this is my second Conversations Through series. I've just finished the Conversations Through Acts with John Andrews, but I am so pleased to be starting a series I've always wanted to do, Conversations Through the Gospel of John. And on screen with me here is Dr. Glenn Balfour. Glenn, hi.
Hi, good to see you all. Or
Yeah,
not to see you all, but...
Yeah, we're a bit in the pink, aren't we, both of us here? So now, Glenn is no stranger to the church that I'm a part of, New Life Church. You've been on our platform a number of times. You're a fantastic teacher, Glenn. Thank you for gracing us with your presence. And not only that, but you are, I guess, Mr. Mattersey Hall. For those who don't know, Mattersey Hall is still the official Bible college of the Assemblies of God. And for your entire life, it seems, you've had a connection with Mattersey Hall.
I have.
You want to explain that a bit?
I have. Well, at the age of 17 and a half, I told my parents I felt God had literally told me to go to Bible college. That was it. You know, probably not the way I'd recommend to do life for people, but that was just how God spoke to me. And the obvious choice was Mattersey Hall. And so at the age of 18, 1982, you do the math, I came to Mattersey Hall as a student. And from then until now, with the exception of altogether 5 years, I've been involved with the college either as a lecturer or as a student from 1982 to now.
Wow.
A true story.
Yeah, that's something else. You deserve a medal for commitment and resilience, I think.
And I'm only 32. Look what it's done to me.
No, I know. That's terrible.
No, I've loved it. I've absolutely loved it. You know, really have.
Yeah, brilliant. And Glenn, viewers, is also an author. He has published some great tutorial. No, that's the wrong word. They are teaching books, aren't they? There we go. Introduction to New Testament Greek. Go on, hold it up shamelessly.
Here is one I prepared earlier.
Yeah.
Which is my Greek book, and I've got a Hebrew one, but I won't show you that one. It just says Hebrew on the front. So yeah,
no,
and
so
we are running some biblical Hebrew and New Testament Greek short courses at Mattersey over the summer. If anyone is interested in more, phone up your local friendly Bible college and we'll point you in the right direction.
I will put a link on screen as we've mentioned that. So in the edit, I will do that. Yeah. So that's, and you use those books when you're teaching students as well. They're part of the curriculum, is that right?
I am afraid to say that anyone that I teach the biblical languages to is forced to use my textbook. It is. There are many other, no doubt, better products available on the market, but this is the one you'll use if I teach you. Brilliant. No, I like it. It's proud, and obviously both of the textbooks have come out of the classroom context. I haven't theoretically decided what works and then put it together. It is genuinely working from the classroom back to the textbook. Which
Great. Well, thank you, Glenn. I'm sure the viewers are getting to know you a little bit, and thank you for helping me with this course, because I want to know stuff. But as a pastor, I want my people to know stuff, and I know that these conversations through that I'm doing here are being watched by lots of people all around the place. So, you know, the ordinary Joe, ordinary Jill Christian are finding these helpful, and so the aim is to grapple for the next sort of 5 weeks with the Gospel of John a bit. I'm going to ask a lot of questions which intrigue me and I want to know the answers to, but hopefully in there I'm going to ask questions which just people in general want to know. So if that's okay.
Well, let me reassure you that if I don't know the answer, I'll just make something up. So let me just give you... Without being sure.
We find that really reassuring. Just put on that air of confidence.
Yeah,
and answer
absolutely.
firmly.
Don't get them to see the white of the eyes. Absolutely.
That's great. And it's probably just worth saying that we have agreed ahead of time that we're going to cover this book in 5 sections. Today, week 1 is just an introduction. We're going to try and understand more about the context of the book and the author, that kind of thing. And then we're going to move to the prologue, which is a very special piece of writing. And then the public ministry of Jesus, and then the private chats he had, private discourse, and then on to the very meaty passion narrative. And I think that covers 5 weeks. So for viewers, that's where we're heading. We hope to get there successfully. Now, Glenn, here we go. This is called the Gospel of John.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of Johns in the New Testament. I found out by reading the book of Acts.
Mm.
Can you clarify for us, who is this gentleman?
Yes, I can. Well, actually, no, I can't. is the actually honest truth. The Gospel of John is called the Gospel of John from the 2nd century onwards. So very early Christian tradition that John is the author of the Gospel.
Mm-hmm.
To be strictly fair, however, just to bring in a little bit of ambiguity there, it is accepted that the title of John's Gospel wasn't on the original form of it, as is true with all 4 Gospels in actual fact. And funnily enough, the name John doesn't appear anywhere in the Gospel of John, which is interesting.
Yes.
So you need to be a little bit flexible with your understanding of who John is. However, the widely held early Christian tradition, which is universally held. In other words, there aren't 3 different people vying for authorship for John's Gospel. There's just one person. Is understood to be John, one of the 2 sons of Zebedee, who is mentioned in the other 3 New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We sometimes bunch them together as the synoptic Gospels, as I'm sure some of the viewers will know. And so that really is as good, I wouldn't say a guess, that's too weak a word, but that's as good as an answer as we're going to get this side of heaven. So most people would argue that this John, referred to in the title, is John, son of Zebedee.
So brother of James.
Brother of James, one of the 2 sons of thunder in the other Gospels, which of course is interesting because in John's Gospel and in the letters of John, they're very much focused around the subject of love, which is a wonderful thought about how from young age to old age, there can be a transformative work of Jesus in someone's life.
Yeah.
Where someone in their younger years, as known as, watch out, he could go off at any point, to a new command I give you, love one another. Sure. So there you go. So if there's hope for the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder, Boergenes, then there's hope for all of us. Right.
So this chap, John, we're talking about, was very used to Jesus. This isn't, he's relying on first-hand testimony, but that testimony is his testimony.
Yep.
That's one of the crucial things about this. Okay. Now, you've already alluded to the letters of John. So he's written something else as well in the New Testament. And without going into depth, we ought to be aware of what else he's written. Can you just take us through that?
Well, you've got the Gospel of John itself. You've got 1, 2, and 3 John. Neither of those in the actual text itself, leave the titles to one side for the moment, in the actual text itself, actually name themselves to be written by someone called John. We need to bear that in mind. But of course, there is another book in the New Testament that does say it's written by John. Now, which John this is could be anyone's guess, but it's not so impossible that it's the same John, son of Zebedee. Could be another John, the elder, one of the leaders of the church at Jerusalem. You could arguably have the book of Revelation included in those books written by John. However, the book of Revelation is so different. It uses a very distinct style of writing called apocalyptic, very vivid, dreamlike language. It's difficult to study the book of Revelation alongside the Gospel of John anyway, just because they're so distinct.
Yeah, okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Glenn. Now, when I was doing the last Conversations Through series, going through Acts, with John Andrews, Dr. John Andrews, I said to him, isn't it a shame that Luke's writings were so rudely interrupted by the Gospel of John, rather than being the Gospel of Luke straight into Acts? But in one sense, it's maybe helpful because John, this Gospel, it stands on its own 2 feet. And it's not in the same gang as the other ones. And the word you let slip out there was synoptic. So can you just explain to us what that means? Why is the Gospel of John not in the same gang as Matthew, Mark, and Luke?
Well, the word synoptic comes from 2 Greek words. Sun, which means with, optic, we get the word eye from it. And we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the synoptic gospels because it's easy to look at them together at the same time. They all follow the same broad structure. They all have the same message. All but 3% of Mark's gospel is in either or both of Matthew and Luke, plus they have extra material of their own. Some of which they share. John's Gospel, sometimes so distinct, it's referred to as the 4th Gospel. In fact, one scholar refers to it as the Maverick Gospel. Okay. Just out there doing its own thing, is really quite distinct. So, for example, we mentioned earlier on this private chat section of John's Gospel, which we're going to see is from John 13 to John 17. You've got 5 chapters there of Jesus, as it were, final will and testament. It's, his final words to his disciples. None of that appears anywhere in any of the 3 synoptic gospels. Quite distinct. We're going to read the prologue next time we're together. You don't get that in the synoptic gospel. In fact, if anything, it's more similar to what you read in Hebrews chapter 1 in some ways. It's more theology than it is the story of someone's life. So John's gospel really is quite distinct. A Christian in the 2nd century called Clement of Alexandria called it the spiritual gospel.
Okay.
And actually, I think if you were going to summarize John's gospel by one word, you might not do much better than describing it as the spiritual gospel, where some things have a significance here, not for what they are in themselves, but for what they signify. For example, and again, we'll come on to this later, but for example, the miracles and the healings in John's gospel are much more distinct. There's only 7 of them. And they're not called healings or miracles as much as they're called signs. In other words, they point. Their significance is for what they say about Jesus more than simply the narrative of the incident itself. So John's gospel really is different from the others.
Okay. I do know that all the gospel writers, they all have an agenda, right?
Yep.
And so what is John's agenda with this gospel? What's the point he's trying to make? It's deeper, it's more spiritual. But what's his agenda behind this?
Yeah. I think I just want to say something about the synoptic gospels. I wouldn't want to give the message that they're not as deep in their own way. They're not as theologically intended in their own way. John's theological intention is just distinct. And there are a number of things that become apparent in John's gospel. One of which is he really wants to draw your attention to the utter uniqueness of Jesus. So we as Christians tend to say Jesus is just like us, by the way, which is perfectly true. It is equally true that Jesus is nothing like us. And that's where truth sometimes is much stronger by, somebody once said an intelligent person is someone who can hold two different thoughts in their head at the same time. And so it isn't that John's gospel is not in line with the others, but he is saying some very distinct things about Jesus, which come out in the very opening sentence. In the beginning was the Word. So, and just a really interesting little thing about the narrative of John's gospel. If you just jumble all your four gospels up together for a moment, which is how we Christians tend to do it.
Yes.
We know that when Jesus heals people, he has a little habit. He has a little modus operandi. He has a little practice, which is he lays hands on people. He lays hands on them when he can reach, when they're physically in the room. Right. When actually you now separate the gospels out, or at least distinguish the gospels from each other, what you realize actually in the synoptic gospels, yes, Jesus does a lot of that. In John's gospel, he doesn't do it once. He just speaks the word. And in actual fact, the very second sign is the sign which is the healing of the royal official son at the end of John chapter 4. Jesus speaks the word, and the significance of the healing that turns it into a sign is the very moment in which Jesus spoke the word, it becomes reality. We're being told something about Jesus as the word, the logos of God. So that's one of the real distinctives of John's gospel, that Jesus is portrayed. The writer's very careful not to take away his humanity.
Yes.
There are certain key things there. The word became flesh.
Yes.
John 1:14. But within those parameters, very, very clear about showing the otherness of Jesus compared to us.
And that really mattered to John.
Absolutely.
That to show the divinity, the otherworldliness of Jesus. So my simple question would be, why? Why do you think that mattered to him?
I think there were two reasons. One, possibly lesser reason, was that people were saying those kinds of things about other things or people that they put their hope or their trust in. Greek philosophers were putting their hope in this ethereal word of God that's just pervades the universe. You've got the growing significance of angels in some Jewish quarters. And I think that what this writer's making a point of doing, actually, all the other things that you might have seen as being the light, actually, that's Jesus. So he really makes a point that Jesus brooks no rivals. So one of the differences between Jesus and us is where Jesus comes from. Actually, what's really significant for this writer is not so much the virgin birth, but the fact that Jesus actually comes from heaven. So Jesus comes from above. We all come from below, which changes everything. So, for example, Jesus could never die a natural death. Never, no one takes my life from me. I have the power to lay it down. And by the way, we sometimes say, who raised Jesus from the dead? Was it the Father? Was it the Spirit? Was it Jesus himself? The answer is all three. And in John's Gospel, it's explicit. I have the power to raise myself up again. So we're getting so I think that's one thing. Jesus, anything anyone else can do, Jesus can do better.
When was this written? When is it likely to have been written? I do know from previous discussions, so I think the viewers will know that from what we can tell, John was the longest lived of the original apostles. He wasn't martyred, I don't believe, found himself in isolation in Patmos.
Patmos, yeah.
And so that gave him a longer span of time to write, per se. So when was this gospel written, do we think?
The generally held view, and this actually is where scholarship and Christian tradition are quite in sync with each other, which doesn't always happen. The generally held view is sometime near the end of the first century, the late 80s, the early 90s, which is significant for another reason, and maybe gives another little thing about John's Gospel that makes it unique. A cataclysmic event had happened about 20 years prior to this time in AD 70, and some people, when they hear that date, will know what I'm referring to. There had been the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So when we're dating New Testament texts, books, we're normally putting them, the most significant thing isn't the actual year, because no one can really know. It's, are they pre that temple destruction or post that temple destruction? And John's Gospel, written right near the end of the first century, is obviously after that destruction. And another big thing that the writer's bringing out is the fact that Jesus replaces everything that was lost by the temple being destroyed. So that fits with the sort of later first century. For example, when the temple's destroyed, that's the end of all sacrifices. There hasn't been any sacrifice within the Jewish faith since that fateful time in AD 70. John chapter 1, verse 29, John the Baptist says about Jesus in a way that would really resonate with a later audience: see the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. In other words, there's a very explicit presentation of Jesus as the fulfillment and the replacement of all of those sacrifices that have gone before.
I used to work in banking, Glenn, and when we used to rehearse for untoward incidents happening, robberies and those kind of things, and we used to rehearse quite regularly. And one of the things that was always embedded into us was, as soon as possible after an event, separate yourselves off from your other staff members and write it down, because your memory can change very quickly, and especially if you discourse with other people. Your memory of the incident and the nuances and the detail can change. So we've just mentioned a late 1st century writing of John's Gospel here. People will be thinking, hang on a minute, if it's 90 AD, that could be 55, 60 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's a long time to put down into print things you think you remember.
Yeah.
So without me asking you a particularly pointed question, is what we read in this gospel, is it all right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me say a couple of things to that. First of all, on the one hand, that very question is something that the writer of the 4th gospel is themselves concerned about. So if you turn right to the end of John's gospel, John chapter 21, which has a few little hallmarks of being signed off by someone else.
Yeah.
They make a point of referring to the disciple whom Jesus loved, often known as the beloved disciple. And they make a point, and I think it's in verse 24, verse 25, they make a point of saying, this is the disciple who wrote these things down, and we know that his testimony is true. So in other words, the gospel itself is keen to give its credentials as giving us primary source material. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing to say is that even though the date of the Gospels is when they were written in their final form,
yes,
no one is suggesting that these Gospels suddenly magically appeared out of nowhere. They are the result of a gathering, some people call it Jesus tradition, but a gathering set of written and oral source material that wasn't just written 5 years ago, it wasn't just written 10 years ago, it actually goes right back to immediately, some of it, after the death of Jesus. So even though John's Gospel is written in its final form at the end of the 1st century, nobody is going to suggest that no one knew this stuff before then. This clearly is in a final form that's been doing the rounds for decades and decades. And hey, let me just say this is, in the 1st century, in the first few centuries, there was no vested value in being a Christian, in being a Christ follower. It wasn't as if you were going to get a better job. It wasn't as if, oh, this could really help me on my way up the ladder or whatever it is. In actual fact, if you put your faith in Jesus, you were up for life-threatening persecution. So it's not as if, in the honest run of things, not as if a book's going to appear out of nowhere and people are going to risk their whole family, their lives, their future, everything on this. People are going to put their trust in this stuff if they know it's reliable.
I do find it interesting that for the disciple who it really mattered to him to show Jesus as otherworldly, not just as human, he misses out the transfiguration. Yes,
yes, he does.
Which for me is like one of the key moments where Jesus, in this moment, I mean, the way it's described is incredibly beautiful anyway, but for me, what goes on there is almost this earthly stuff, the meat of Jesus almost just cannot cope for a moment with the divinity of the Christ, and John misses the opportunity to write about that.
He does, and it will be unreasonable to think that the writer and the readers wouldn't be aware of that incident. So clearly, this is selective. There are many things I've written to you, there are many things that I could have written. The whole world couldn't contain them, but these things I've written so that you might believe. So you might want to say, well, why do other things suit John's purpose here in this preach, if you like, but the transfiguration maybe doesn't so well. There's an interesting little thing. I said a little bit earlier on that one of the things that John's Gospel wants to do, it wants to have Jesus as other to everyone else. There is one Jesus. For example, in John's Gospel and in the letters of John, we're never called sons of God. Paul calls us sons of God. We're adopted as sons in Romans 8. That language is never used in John's Gospel. We are children of God, but he reserves the word son for the only begotten son. So why does the writer do that? Because he wants to show the otherness of Jesus. And I think that might be a little clue as to here as to why the transfiguration maybe isn't something he's going to pick out, because of course, how many people do you see at the transfiguration?
Sure.
And the answer is 3. Well, we don't want to talk about the others. We don't want to talk about Moses. We don't want to talk about Elijah. We want to talk about Jesus. That's it. Everyone's from below, even Elijah, even Moses. And I think sometimes it's a bit like when you are preaching a sermon. There are perfectly valid things that you could say, but they're not going to help you make the point you need to make here. You'll make them in a different preach. And I think there's a little bit of that in the 4th Gospel. And by the way, the writer clearly knows about it. Most scholars think that when he refers to in the prologue, and we all beheld his glory, the one of the only begotten, that is an allusion to the transfiguration. So it's not as if he's not aware of it. He's just going to pick on other things.
Okay, yeah, helpful. Never thought of it that way. Very, very, very good. All right. So let's just delve into John the person a little more. Again, assumptions I've held that may or may not be wrong. I've always assumed John was the youngest.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I mean, he certainly seems to live the longest. So, you do the math. That would make some sense. He is one of the younger ones. Some people have picked the point out from the synoptic Gospels that it's only Jesus and Peter that have to pay the temple tax. Remember, there's that little coin in the fish's mouth for both of them, as if none of the other disciples are old enough to be eligible for paying tax.
Yeah.
So that would certainly include John, son of Zebedee, as well. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Right. And so how educated would John, as a young Jewish man, have been, and a sane man? When did they become? What age did people be called men? What kind of education level would we have expected from someone like John at the time he got picked up by this traveling Rabbi Jesus, would you think?
It's very difficult to be certain on that. We sometimes think that all of the disciples had no education at all. And indeed, it's interesting that when Peter and John meet with the Sanhedrin in Acts, the point is made, these are ignorant, unschooled people. By the way, the word in Greek for unschooled is idiotes. They were idiots. That's the kind of term. However, that could have been a little bit deliberately insulting language on the part of the audience. And it could well be that these disciples knew how to read scripture, so they were literate to that extent. They knew how to memorize scripture. And it's interesting how, although they were fishermen when they're first called, in John's gospel, the point is also made that some of them were also disciples of John the Baptist before they're disciples of Jesus. So again, there is a sense in which they may have already been on a discipling spiritual journey. So I have a feeling that these boys, and by the way, Jesus has girl disciples as well. That's important. He has women that are disciples. He doesn't spend night and day with them. Well, go figure. You wouldn't, but they're still disciples. But, you know, the disciples were a mixed group of people, and I'd like to think that they were bright enough to be able to navigate their way around the Jewish scriptures at the very least.
Okay.
That's how I do it.
Right. And so during this period where John is in Jesus's gang, following Jesus around as a rabbi, is there anything we can glean from, well, not so much from John's gospel, but from the other gospels, about what John is like? If we were to do a character reference for him, are there any clues?
Well, obviously, in the other Gospels, you've got James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder, whose mother represents my boys to Jesus. I feel an old Christian musical coming along here to say who's going to be the greatest, you know, in the kingdom. Can it be one of these two? Which is a fantastic little preach in some ways, because in fact the two people that are on the left and the right of Jesus when he comes in his glory are the two thieves either side of him on the cross. The very little, you know, are you really ready to be baptized at the baptism? Do you really know what you're asking for when you ask to be on my right and my left? Really? You know. However, you do get none of that in John's gospel. And the interesting thing is, given that John, son of Zebedee, is the beloved disciple who appears in John's gospel, actually, he doesn't appear until the night before Jesus is betrayed. The first time we see the beloved disciple in John's gospel is in John chapter 13. So all of that extra information we see about John, we get from the other gospels. And again, maybe I'm being overly imaginative here, you see, but that all fits into John's gospel. If the whole point of John's gospel is, I want Jesus to be lifted up. If the whole point of John's gospel is, I want Jesus to fill the room. I don't want Elijah to fill the room. I don't want Moses to fill the room. I don't want anyone else to fill the room. Actually, this writer says, I don't even want myself to fill the room. I'm not even going to tell you you don't even know my name. And the whole anonymity of himself as the beloved disciple is almost the most perfect final thing of, actually, all I want to do is talk about Jesus.
So he just wants to write himself out of the story. It's an act of, it's not just an act of glorifying Jesus. It is an act of humility, even though he wouldn't say he's a humble person, probably. Yeah. But that's in fact what it is. So we know more about John from the other writers than we do about John himself. That's a fair statement.
Yeah. And the most significant thing about John in John's gospel is that he says absolutely nothing about himself. Absolutely nothing.
He reclined at Jesus's breast. Maybe you could tell us how people ate in those days. Actually, that would be helpful, or else we get lots of weird ideas about what was going on there. But I mean, him and Jesus were close. This term, the beloved disciple, does he come across as a guy who, maybe because he was very young, he hung around Jesus closer than the others? Can we intimate these things? Are we just totally guessing here?
Well, I think really all of the above. I think that's all perfectly reasonable. One thing we do know about this disciple, he really is that close to Jesus. We don't know what brought that about, but something did. It's not random. It's not, happenstance. And I think it's right. I don't think Jesus has favorites, but he does have close friends. And I think that's an important thing. And I think that your closest friends are the people you spend the most time with. It's almost self-fulfilling. And it's very clear, whatever's brought this about, this beloved disciple is very close to Jesus. This doesn't quite come out in John's gospel quite so much, but in the other gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you've got the 12 disciples, but you've also got an inner group of 3 disciples. And the inner group of 3 is, of course, Peter, James, and John. There you go. So that makes quite a lot of sense in some ways, that actually we see from the other synoptic gospels that actually John is one of these inner 3. In fact, because it's those 3 that are taken up the Mount of Transfiguration, which makes it all the more interesting. There's no reference to transfiguration in John's gospel. And so we know that this is a close friend of Jesus, and maybe he was the youngest. That could make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, one other interesting thing there, only mentioned in John's gospel, is that when Jesus is dying on the cross, he hands responsibility for his mother over to the next brother. But of course, the next brother is not one of his brothers, who is mentioned. They are mentioned back in John chapter 6.
Sure.
The one he hands him over to is the beloved disciple. And from that moment on, the beloved. So there's a real sense in which the beloved disciple is closer to Jesus than his own family. And so close that Jesus is going to hand responsibility for his mother over to the beloved disciple. I mean, that's high levels of trust and friendship.
It is. Do you think James would have been too bothered about that? It's interesting.
Who knows?
James,
not bothered enough to write it down anywhere.
Yeah. Well, James didn't last that long, actually, did he? And so you do wonder in Jesus' wisdom whether he did hand his mother over to a disciple who was probably going to have some longevity.
Yeah.
So that's
and of course, Jesus does know. It's interesting when you get to John chapter 21, Jesus says about Peter, when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone will take you where you do not want to go. He said this to signify by what kind of death Peter would glorify Jesus. So there's a sense in which Jesus intimates that he knows what's going to happen to the disciples after he's gone, in inverted commas. And so it will be perfectly logical to me that he knows what's going to happen to the beloved disciple, which he's going to live to an old age.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's carry on talking about John rather than the gospel at the moment, because there is this vast span of time. Jesus' death, resurrection, and then he writes 80, 90 AD. He writes.
Yep.
So we've got this vast swathe of time during which the Apostle Paul is churning out stuff, turning the Mediterranean, the Roman world, causing havoc everywhere in some places, planting great churches in other places, all this kind of stuff. And John is doing what? I know this is guesswork again. But there must have been something written about it. I mean, what's he doing?
It all depends. This John could, of course, be the Peter, James, and John who head up the church in Jerusalem. It could be him. It could be another John. Who knows? It's very clear to me that this John has been quietly working and gathering disciples for many, many years. And one of the culminations of this is the gospel of love, as it's sometimes been called, John's gospel. And I think that can help us sometimes. I think sometimes we can be working in our quiet little corners thinking, well, what difference are we making? But in actual fact, we can be building up a legacy and a store and an experience that really can be handed on to the next generation in our later years. And therefore, I'd encourage people, I'll be careful that I don't get into principle language now and get everyone to study. But I would encourage you, find ways for what God has done in your life to be transferred into a legacy that can be passed on to the next generation after you've gone. So somehow you've got to record this stuff. Whether you write it, which I still think is by far and away the most obvious way to record stuff, whether you film it, whether you sing it, whether you radio it, whether you YouTube it, whatever you do, but find ways to pass the good things that God's done in your life on to the next generation. Because if you don't, when God calls you home, that will pass as well.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a little...
No, that's helpful, because it is interesting, because he does disappear off the scene, and it's all about Paul for a period. But clearly John had, during that period, made this change from, like you intimated earlier, a son of thunder, softened. It's all about Jesus. Clearly you can see this is now all about Jesus. Yeah. He's the epitome of less of me, more of him. By the time he comes to write, it's about him, and it's about love. Him and love. This is his life's meaning now, and it comes flowing out in his writings. And yes, he must have had a readership. There were people waiting with bated breath somewhere to read what this man had penned. And of course, if he did write Revelation as well, there were churches in Asia. Yes.
Absolutely. And of course, if you read 1, 2, and 3 John, there are house churches mentioned there that this writer clearly has access to. As you say, if he's the John of the book of Revelation, you've got 7 churches there which cover the whole of what was then known as Asia Minor. Now it's the never eat shredded wheat. It's the western side of modern day Turkey. So
he could well have been well travelled.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. That's helpful to know. The book itself, the Gospel of John, full of symbols as well, isn't it? There's a lot of symbolism in John.
This writer very clearly uses, clearly defined literary devices, stuff you use when you're writing, like metaphor, like symbolism, like irony. There are almost jokes going on in the fourth gospel, in John's gospel at certain points. For example, one of the little things that happens in John's gospel, whenever Jesus has a conversation with someone, they just don't get what he's saying. There's this misunderstanding motif, it's called. So you've got, Jesus says to Nicodemus, you must be born a second time. And Nicodemus gives this rather, incredulous, I've got to clamber back up inside my mother again in order, it's almost too humorous. It beggars belief, really. If you ask me, the woman says, I will give you living water. And, she says to him, well, you don't have a bucket. It's just that level of, and it's all part of that, John. And there is symbolism, even in the narrative, there is symbolism. For example, living water is flowing water. It's water from a stream, unlike water from a stagnant well. So even Jacob's well has a symbolism. I know it's a piece, it's an ancient artifact, if you like. You could see it, but in the fourth gospel, it is symbolic for waters that can never truly satisfy you because they're stagnant, because they're still, because they're dead.
So before I round this up, Glenn, is there anything else that you think we ought to know at this stage that probably won't come up later?
One of the interesting things about John's Gospel, just as we draw it to a close, is that there is an ancient scrap of papyrus known to textual critics as P52. And in fact, if you want to, well, you can see it online if you want to. Just do a little search on Papyrus 52, or you can go to the John Rylands Library in Manchester and ask to look at the thing. But that is the oldest accepted scrap of the New Testament. And it is from a few verses from John chapter 18. It's one reason why we can't date John's Gospel later than the 90s AD.
Well, Glenn, thank you. You have whetted our appetite. It's going to be a fascinating little series, this, and I think it's always helpful to start with the context, because then when people start dipping into the gospel, things can make a bit more sense, or things will leap off the page for them. So I think we've done reasonable justice to it in this first session. And next week, just as a teaser, we're going into this prologue, which is very, very different from anything that's written in the Gospels, and quite profound. So I can't wait to get stuck into that, and I know that you're going to help us see some fresh things in that. So thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. And just to say this, just to folks, obviously, you're going to be reading through John's Gospel. As you read it through, just see if you can identify what I call the P's of John's Gospel. You've got the prologue, you've got the public ministry, you've got the private ministry, you've got the passion narrative. Just see if you can identify those 5 P's, well, 4 P's for these purposes, as we work your way through.
Brilliant. Yes, you do that, and that will help you all as we move through the series as well. So Glenn and I, we're just going to say goodbye to you viewers. Thank you for tuning in. Have a fantastic little journey, fascinating little journey through John as you read in it, and we'll gather again next week, see what you've made of that, and dip into chapter 1. God bless you. Thank you.
Praise God.
Goodbye.